Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is good. So happy to be back here studying Silat Yesharim together, the teachings of the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Today's class is the second of our lunches and learns. We began last week with a brief introduction to who Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is, and we discussed the context in which he lived, where he lived, what was his audience, what were his proclivities, what was the oeuvre that he left us. The Ramchal is a giant in traditional Jewish life. The Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was and continues to be a mystery in many ways. Much of his writings were destroyed, but what we have in our hands is profound and radical in so many ways. I think that one of the things about the Ramchal that people don't realize was that he was a radical in the way that he understood Kabbalah, his understanding of Lurianic Kabbalah. We'll talk more about that over the course of the year. But again, just this really great to be with all of you and to study Mesilat Yesharim together is amazing. So welcome to you who are here live, and also welcome to all of those who will be joining us in the recording of this as well. I want you also, whenever you click on, whether it's during the week or next month or next year, wherever and whenever you drop into the lunches and learns, that you feel that we're together learning Torah, because learning Torah is chavruta. It's in connection, and connected learning is key. So welcome back to all of you who are rejoining us, and to all of you here for the first time. Bruchim Habayim, welcome. We're going to be learning the continuation of the Hakdama of the Mechaber, the introduction of the author, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, which we began last week. And just for those of you who weren't with us, to introduce you to this, and for those of you who are with us, to reintroduce you to this, the Mechaber, the Ramchal, begins with a very counterintuitive line. He says, he said, I'm not writing this, I'm not the author of this manual, of this book, in order to teach you chidushim, novele, something that is that you've never seen or thought about before, but rather, he says, to remind you of the things that you already know, but that you forget, that we all forget, because of their accessibility, because of their prevalence. They're so prevalent, they're so obvious, they're so readily available to us, these truths, that we don't remember them. We forget about them. Now, although the Ramchal doesn't go into this in the Hakdama, in the introduction, it's interesting to think about the things in our lives that we do forget about, and things in our lives that we don't forget about. Of course, if one were to have to remember over and over again to breathe, it would make breathing laborious, and it's a good thing, right? That it's part of our autonomous nervous system, that we can actually be unconscious of our breath, so that when we're sleeping, we're continuing to breathe, and so on. There are things that we don't bring to mind, and in not bringing them to mind, actually, it allows them to be present. But then there are things that we forget about, that because we forget about them, they endanger us, right? Forgetting to look when we're walking, forgetting to look both ways, forgetting to eat, God forbid. There are certain things that are, because of their being forgotten, they endanger us. And Ramchal, I think, would place in the category of those things that are dangerous to our spiritual lives, the forgetting of the various things that he will enumerate in Mesilat Yesharim. So he began with that counterintuitive statement about that I'm not teaching you something new, which, of course, for many of us, when we read this book, it's kind of like, really? Nothing new? And there are a lot of new things in here. But underneath it, I think the Ramchal is saying that that if you were to ask us what's the most important piece of our lives, we wouldn't point to various objects in our lives, but the holding of those objects in a larger container, whether the container is divine love or compassion, it could be meaning and purpose, whatever it is. It's the container itself which is often forgotten. We focus so much of our lives on the attainment of the things inside of the container, but we don't actually take the time to develop the container itself. Kind of like perception, I just want to say, just like there are objects of perception, but very few of us look at listening, that the object of perception is confused for the very inquiry that is more fundamental, which is perceptive faculties themselves. Like, what is perceiving? What is knowing? Right? And it's, in a way, it's so obvious in the Zen tradition. They call it, just as the hand can't shake itself or the eye see itself, that there's the obvious nature of our own consciousness is so much of a given that we don't actually look at it. And that's kind of my own take on this, in a way, which is the counterintuitive statement that the Ramchal makes, that this isn't new, is actually a statement about suchness or reality itself. There are so many things that are so obvious to us, like our own existence, that because they are so prevalent and so obvious and so all-pervasive and so all-encompassing, they slip very gently into the background, and what comes to the fore are objects of perception and objects of life objects, including our personalities and our egos and our careers and all of the phenomena that fill our daily life. And so the hand can't see itself, shake itself, and the eye can't see itself, is a way of saying that that which is most obvious will always escape awareness unless we make an effort to become aware of it. And that's kind of where the Ramchal goes here. He's going to say that Milsa del Ramya ale inish lava daite, that the thing that you don't think about, the thing that you don't put your mind on, Milsa del Ramya ale de enash, that you don't place your mind on, it's lava daite. You don't have das, you don't have awareness. So the Ramchal is going to continue now. We're going to learn a little bit more about what kinds of individuals. We had a typology last week where we said the Ramchal lamented that there are those who are so they are the smartest ones, the most intellectually capable, the ones whose minds are so alive and so sharp, harif, that those people in the world unfortunately don't feel as if elements of the divine life or elements of spiritual life are important enough to spend time on. They spend all their time, the Ramchal writes, in various other fields, economics and mathematics and business. But when it comes to placing your mind on divine service and on awareness and self-evolution, self-development, he says, unfortunately, the majority of people who spend their time in those science, the science of God and the God science, those people are actually not the ones capable of disclosing the depth of God's science. And what happens, he says, is that they give God's science a bad name. The science of knowing God, the science of knowing oneself, soul science. That becomes branded as the place where you go if you're a hippy dippy, or if you're a woo woo, or if you're country granola, or all of these other terms that in our modern day are ways of, you must be an Oprah spiritual person. So what about the rigorous application of a system to self-development? That the Ramchal says that doesn't happen. He says we don't have people doing that, and so the work of spirituality becomes diluted and denuded of its deeper attraction to those other people. People think, oh, you have a spiritual practice, you must be wounded. You have a spiritual practice, you must be not scientific. You must not be a rational individual if you love God, and so on. All these other things that people say. And I think in my own personal life, it wasn't until I came across the work of Ken Wilber that I became convinced that the pre-rational and the trans-rational though they might look alike in their non-rationality, are worlds apart. And that Ken Wilber introduced me to the science of self-development. In science here meaning practice, the practices that one does in order to disclose higher and higher levels of evolution and self-knowing that creates a better world. And the Ramchal is kind of in that way here in the beginning of the book, in his Hakadama, his introduction. He's also saying that if you don't approach your spiritual life with rigor, you wind up thinking that the spiritual life is made up of all kinds of, imaginary spiritual practices. And some of the ones that he names are like the false piety of ascetic practices, where in the period of the Ramchal's life and before, people would go out and roll in the snow in order to achieve piety, or to atone for sins, or they would fast for long hours and days and weeks, or they would say Tehillim all day long, psalms, they would be muttering prayers. And the Ramchal says that misunderstanding of what deep spiritual practice, the fruits of deep spiritual practice, and the work of tilling the field for those fruits to appear, that confusion is lamentable for those who think it is, for those who think that spiritual practice are those activities exclusively, and for those who are on the outside thinking, oh, that's what spiritual practice is, right? So, and I mentioned Sam Harris last week. I'm a big fan of Sam Harris. Woo-hoo for Sam Harris. Like, bring me a little Sam Harris, because Sam Harris, the atheist that he is, just wrote a book called Waking Up, Spirituality Without Religion. And in it, he basically explores practices that bring one to a place of dveikut, a place of deep logging on to reality with a capital R and not a lowercase r, which is essentially what's at stake here. Like, how do we generate within ourselves and within a larger community a sense of God's closeness, and God here meaning love, meaning purpose, meaning the big R, reality writ large. And even Sam Harris, who has no love lost for God and for religion, his book is a kind of modern day Mesilat Yesharim in certain ways. Like, here's the practice, right? Not like, did you mumble your words for the week and fill your quota, right? Although, obviously, as a rabbi and as the founder of Romemu, there's great beauty in those words, and there's great beauty in religious practices. But the Ramchal doesn't want us to confuse like the fulfillment of obligations towards our particular Jewish path or particular religious path, and the deeper understanding of dveikut, the deeper understanding of what that means to adhere, to be logged on to consciousness, to the higher levels of consciousness. And that's where we left off last week. I'm hoping that if those of you are following along, have the book, the Mesilat Yesharim, or you've downloaded the PDF that we made available for you last week. Just also before we start with this lunches learning, I'm going to be, at the suggestion of many people, finishing at around 1:40, 1:45, depending on how far we go, knowing full well that you're taking out of your very busy day, and that an hour might be a bit much. We went a bit long last week, so we'll be stopping around 1:40, 1:45. And again, I welcome your comments and your questions to my email, rabbi@romemu.org. Last week we were on page, I'll pick up on page 4 on the bottom, והחסידות. והחסידות האמיתי הנרצה והנחמד רחוק מציור שכלנו. כי זה דבר פשוט, מילתא דלרמיה עלי דאנה שלבה דייתי. That in lamenting that the Chassidut, and Chassidut here, he doesn't mean the movement that began in 18th century Ukraine. He means Chassidut as it was originally understood as mitchased im kono, that someone who is in a relationship of going beyond, of understanding deeper intelligence, deeper yearnings and deeper wantings, the chasidut hanirtzeva nechmad, the deeper piety, the deeper spiritual frequency that each of us should attune ourselves, our instrument to, is lost because of its confusion with an erroneous pseudo spirituality, and it's distant from our sichlenu, tziyur sichlenu. It's very distant from our own conceptual frames. We don't really know what Chassidut looks like. For it's simple and obvious that if you don't think about this, if you don't spend your time mapping out consciousness and spirituality, then you won't have a very clear understanding of what the road map, right? What is the roadmap? And if you don't have a clear understanding of the roadmap, then you're not going to know how to get to your destination. So we don't have a real clear understanding of the map. We don't have a real clear understanding of what we're looking at, what's the thing, and so therefore we don't really have the tools to get to that thing. And even, he says, even if the beginnings and the foundations of Chassidut or saintliness, I don't really like that word, saintliness. I love saints. Saintliness, I think here again, it's more about the vibration of compassionate living, or the frequency of spiritual attunement. Like to become an attuned instrument, even if it's clear to us that we need to become attuned, we don't know how to attune. Even if you think that it's a foundation and it's vital. Im lo yasok b'hem yireh, pratav v'lo yakirem, yavor aleihem v'lo yargish bam. He says, you, me, all of us, we will witness the details of this attunement, but we won't recognize them. We'll look and we won't recognize it. We won't have a good map before us, so we don't know the terrain. I'm turning the page now to the top of page 6. He says, listen, recognizing the details and the particulars and the nuances and the sophistication of the spiritual life, yira, ava, what those qualities mean, love of God or fear of God, what those things really translate into in our experience. Knowing those things and knowing where to find them in ourselves are not implanted in us the way our physical inclinations and our physical coordinates, our physical responsibilities and obligations. That knowing that relates to our physical body is an innate knowing, and the spiritual life is not innate in that way. He says, for example, kashena v'yikitza, going to sleep and waking up, harav ve'asova, hunger and satiation, chol shart miot achukukot b'tiv'einu. Says all of those other natural bodily functions that we have at our disposal, all of those things are emergent unconscious, right? Meaning the emergent unconscious, as Ken Wilber articulates it in a number of his works, there are parts of us that genetically have been are an inheritance to us that we don't have to do anything for them to emerge, right? They emerge on their own timeline, but we don't need means to effectuate their effect or to their ends, right? It just happens. Like my boys, my two boys, right? They're eating and sleeping. All of that is already ingrained in them physically. And my wife and I didn't have to do anything. We just stood back and watched, the miracle of its unfolding. The way that the boys knew from the moment they were born, the way all infants know from the moment they're born where the breast is, and how to feed them itself, and how when it's hungry, when the baby's hungry, humans cry, and when they're sated, they know that they're sated, And that's not the case with more deeper existential needs as they emerge, and higher existential needs, that if we don't do particular practices and engage in particular means, those levels of reality don't emerge. Those levels of development don't become an acquired trait of consciousness. So here the Ramchal says essentially, Shena, Yikitzah, Ra'av, Sova, all of these physical things, all of the elements, these parts of us that are stamped in our nature, that are a part of who we are. He says, no, when it comes to spiritual life, we need means in order, and devices and strategies in order to acquire and to bring forth these latent potentialities within us, right? They're there waiting for the irrigation that we can provide through practices. Lo yibatzru gam ki mafsidim, and not just that, not only must we proactively bring forth these things, but there are no shortage of obstacles and hindrances that get in the way of that kind of awakening, right? V'lo yachseru d'rachim l'archik mafsidehem, and there is no shortage as well of devices to keep away the deterrence, the hindrance. And so the Ramchal places us, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto places us in a continuum where, acknowledging that on the physical level of existence there are emergent levels of development, emergent qualities within the physical body that come about naturally. There's a natural emergence of various things. They might be unconscious, right? But at a certain point in development, it will emerge, right? Like the growth of the child and various other things that are there even from birth, various states of awareness. But when we speak about the spiritual life, although each and every one of us has, we each have access to spiritual states of awareness and consciousness. They are the acquisition and the acquire, liknot, the word he uses, liknot, to own them. The ownership of those traits of consciousness that are the rarefied heights or depths of spiritual life are only acquired through repetition and through hard work against the deterrents and the hindrances that would affect the acquisition of those traits. Like, an example, right? So in Buddhism, and in the meditative life in Buddhism, there are the 5 hindrances. That when you sit down to meditate, it's not like sitting down to fall asleep or sitting down to eat, right? I don't have to, there's no hindrance to my eating, right? I know when I'm hungry, and I know how to sate my hunger. I don't know, I might know how to, right? I wouldn't know innately how to quiet my mind, but I might find out that if I meditated 20 minutes a day, if I davened 3 times a day, if I did a particular spiritual practice, right, then my mind might begin to soften and relax. But there are hindrances and there are deterrents. There are all manner of doubt and exhaustion, lethargy and sloth, and all of the things that come up that make it difficult for me, all of us, to acquire those traits of consciousness. And so the Ramchal places us in a world where there are things that we know without any doubt, and those things on the physical level that we can identify, and we know how to actually work with them. But we need to work hard, the Ramchal says, to remind ourselves to locate the practices and the devices for the acquisition of the awareness of God, or the awareness of spiritual attunement. And then we have to also work at the deterrents and hindrances so as to be able to engage in those practices and to acquire those spiritual traits. Im kain, efo ech, lo yitzarech laotzi zman al ha'iyun hazeh. לדעת אמיתס הדברים ולדעת הדרך לקנוסם ולקיימם. מאין תבוא חכמה זו בלב האדם אם לא יבקשנה. וכיוון שכבר יתאמץ אצל כל אדם צורך תמימוס עבודה וחובס טהרסה וניקיונה, שזולת אלה אינן נרצית ודאי כלל, אלא ננאסס ומסואבס, כי כל לבבות דורש השם וכל יצר מחשבות ומדי. He says, listen, if we don't make this effort, and if we acknowledge that the means to acquiring spiritual states of awareness or spiritual evolution requires, right, effort and devices and stratagems and strategies, right? We need post-it notes and reminders, and we need bells, we need classes, we need a sangha or a tzibur, we need a community, a kihila, we need all of these things. If that's the case, the Ramchal says, Abazoi, if that's the case, how can it be possible to imagine that we would spend 20 to 30 hours a week on a career and the attainment of wealth, or the attainment of hours? Also acknowledge that you need devices and you need to push work against the deterrence. The Ramchal asks a very simple question. How can it be that you don't spend time on acquiring those means towards the ends that you yourself acknowledge are the vital element of your life? It's really a good question, isn't it? How is it that we asked this last week, that there isn't anyone who is a parent with an awareness of the difficulty and the effort involved in raising healthy, wholesome, beautiful children, where there isn't anyone who's a conscious parent, or a parent trying to raise their children consciously, who would admit that when push comes to shove, our children are the most important work that we'll ever do in our lives. And how many of us can be honest about how much work we've put into becoming great parents? Now, this isn't to say that if your parents didn't read a manual on parenting, or on helicopter parenting, or tiger parenting, or whatever the paradigm is now, lion parenting or lizard parenting or whatever it is, that you couldn't have been a good parent, because there is something about parenting that comes naturally. There's no doubt about that. There is something intuitive about loving your children. But there's also a tremendous amount of hard work that goes into it. And there's a tremendous amount of literature that has been written, and there are classes and all manner of things. But if you don't do the work, then you won't see the results to some degree. Another example. If parents come to a synagogue and say, listen, Rabbi, I really think it's important for my kids to grow up with a Jewish education, because it's really painful to me to imagine them not knowing about their heritage. How many parents who come to older children whose kids have nothing to do with Judaism, because they don't think Judaism is a legitimate resource for them in their lives. They come into my office and they say, Rabbi, can you turn my kids on? Can you make a case for why they should go to synagogue once a week, or have a Jewish home? And I ask the parents about their Jewish life. And if a parent says to me, well, I'm not willing to give up a Saturday morning because X, Y, and Z, or I'm too busy, then I'm inevitably say, well, I can't speak to your kids, because if you can't find the time to do the work yourself, but you claim it's important, then your kids won't see its importance either. And so the Ramchal is basically turning to the reader, in me, you, all of us, and saying, those things that you profess are of ultimate value for you. How many hours are you clocking on learning the skills necessary for those areas of your life that require expertise? Because the Ramchal is saying spirituality requires more than being someone who a drop-in spirituality person. Like, what are we doing? That's what Ramchal wants to say. What are you doing? And if you don't have a strategy, the Ramchal wants you to be a little bit more serious about your spiritual practices. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment to say, if you're on this phone call, you're probably already giving time to your spiritual life. If you're on this class. And I also want to make time. But the Ramchal and all great spiritual masters are lovingly chastising and saying, come on, 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes. So here he says, Mana nebiyom tochicha umay imitrashalnu min ha'iyun hazeh v'ni'inachnu davar shehu kol kach mutal aleinu shehu ikar ma Hashem Eloheinu sho'el mi'imanu. He says, what are we going to say when push comes to shove at the end of the day, at the end of our lives? If we were weak, if we were lackadaisical, and if we left in the corner, if we left over something that is so essential to what our purpose in this world is, what God is asking of us, is the literal translation. If we aren't committing ourselves to what is ikar, and instead of what is tafel, what is inconsequential or not as consequential. הייתכן שיגע ויעמול שכלנו בחקירות אשר לא נתחייבנו בם, בפלפולים אשר לא יצא לנו שום פרי מהם, בדינים אשר אינם שייכים לנו. And here is a very strong argument against, I think, Jewish education, or in general education. Is it possible that we will busy and work, right, and exert ourselves and labor in our minds, in analyses and investigations that we're not obligated in pilpul as a kind of sophistry, in Talmudic learning, right, argumentation that isn't that doesn't bring forth any fruit, and laws that are not really related to us, but that which we required to our Creator, Chovah Rabbah. This is the Ramchal is throwing it down. The Ramchal is throwing it down and saying, and I want to begin with where it is in his critique of Jewish life, and then expand it beyond Jewish spiritual life. The Ramchal is saying to the establishment and to the contemporary religious scene in Judaism, where the majority of learning was focused on Talmud and focused on learning Talmud in a particular way, and the academic learning of Talmud, even in yeshiva world, and I use that term academic anachronistically, meaning that there was a very scholarly approach to learning Talmud, and so much of the Talmud had to do with learning for learning's sake. It wasn't learning for the sake of practicing, because so much of the Talmud deals with things having to do with the period of the temple and so on. And the Ramchal says, you're spending all of your time learning Talmud. But what about learning love of God, learning fear and awe and humility and zrizut, which is alacrity and exuberance, all of these inner places of character development? Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that work if all of the brightest and the best of the Jewish world spend their time learning academically, and saying that that's the sum total of their spiritual life? Now, in my personal opinion, that's, the Ramchal could be leveling this against many areas of the Jewish world that I've been exposed to, where the deeper study of the heart and the deeper study of states of awareness and consciousness and qualities that aren't just important in our service of God and service of spirit, but in terms of our functioning in the world. The Torah of patience, like not just the value of patience, but how one does it. Like the Torah of working with rage or anger, the Torah of disillusionment, the Torah of ecstasy. All of these are sugyot as well. All of these are every bit as deep and as powerful as learning about Shteim Ochsen B'Talis, learning about if two people were grabbing a talit, that they're studying the Talmud. Now, this is also applicable outside of the Jewish world, And then they showed me the way, showed me how to be logical, rational, right? All of the ways that that our university systems and our educational models for children and so on are permeated with learning about things, learning objects, learning about subject matter. But that when it comes to teaching character, which of course there's a whole movement afoot. My dear friend Norman Atkins and Dave Levin at KIPP and other schools, charter schools, where they focus on character development. Teaching children how to succeed, like that movement away from information and loading us up with information instead of teaching tools of transformation, right? I wish, as Dave Levin and Norm Atkins and others talk about, that I had been taught in school about zest, like how to be zesty, right? How to be zesty. Like you go to a rabbinical school and they teach you how to read a book, which is wonderful. And I think that it's important for rabbis to be able to be Yodei Sefer, to know how to read a book. But very few rabbinical schools will actually are teaching hands-on and then spending hours and hours teaching us rabbis and clergy how to, to relax the mind and to focus the mind and to soften the heart and how to log on to God and what that feels like. So how can we then go out into communities and turn on people and be turned on by people who want to place that as part of their Jewish educational agenda, right? This year we're going to focus on experiencing the love of God or the love of Goddess. So the Ramchal's critique, the Ramchal's polemic, the Ramchal's charge is every bit as resonant for me today as a leader in the Jewish community and for looking at Jewish pedagogy and looking at various institutions. And it's every bit as important also in terms of my day-to-day life, right? What's the essence of my day? Is the essence of my day being bogged down in the details of my day, which of course all of us struggle with, or is it about connecting with the container that holds my day, like my deeper ikar, like what's my essence, what's the day all about underneath it all, and how can I remember that? How can I remember that? Is what the Ramchal, I think, is saying to me and to us. אם לא נסתכלנו ולא יענו מהי העיר האמיתית ומה הנפל, איך נקנה אותה ואיך נמלט מן ההבל העולמי המשכך אותה מליבנו, לא תשכח ותלך אף על פי שידענו חובתה. He says when it comes to the notion of, in our tradition, called yir'ah, what does real yir'ah look like? Is yir'ah, which means literally fear, but does it mean a sense of God is watching me and I better be careful? Is it have deeper branches and qualities to it? Yir'ah is a state of awareness. And what does that look like? What does it feel like? That's a part of our development as spiritual beings. And if we don't look at it, we don't inquire after it, we won't know what it is. Also, love of God. אהבה כמוכן, אם לא נשתדל לקבוע אותה בליבנו, בכוח כל האמצעים המגיעים אותנו לזה, איך נמצאנה בנו, מאין יבוא הדבקות וההתלהטות בנפשותנו עמו יתברך ועם תורתו, אם לא נשעה אל גדולתו ואל רוממותו שיוליד בליבנו הדבקות הזה. The Ramchal is really, in these paragraphs that we're learning this week, he's in a way the precursor to the Baal Shem Tov in many ways, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Ramchal is saying, how is it possible? How is it possible that that these things which all of us think are really, really vital, loving God, being aware of the mystery of creation, the mystery of being itself, how is it possible that we can acknowledge both the radical, fundamental importance of those qualities and yet not have a program implemented to acquire them? How is that possible, says the the Ramchal. And we would say that to ourselves too, if we would translate it into our own language too. How is it that we all would agree that being fully present and mindful is vital, but yet we don't have a schedule for developing and acquiring mindfulness? We want to live an open-hearted life, but we have to ask ourselves how many hours of the day and the week and the month and year are devoted to open-hearted practice and learning. So I just want to take the last 4 minutes here before we finish. We'll come back to this, God willing, next Tuesday. In our learning, we'll come back to the completion of this paragraph where the Ramchal will go through various qualities that are required and continue in the same vein of invigorating us, inspiration to have a year of being yashar, of being logged on to the divine. And take the next 2 minutes or so just to sit together in silence and being present to the container itself, to holding the container, and before we close. May the source of life bless you, bless me, bless all sentient beings with the yearning to prioritize and to take action and very concrete steps to making self-development. And by that I don't mean self-absorption, but self-development, awareness of love, awareness of mystery, awareness of all of those refined character traits that can make us walk in the world with ease, that can help us to walk in the world with compassion and goodness. May the source of life strengthen within us the yearning for that, and for the location, the discovery of various tachbulot, strategies and devices in which to acquire liknot, to acquire the way of yashrut, the way of integrity. May all of us be integral in our Jewish practice and integral in our lives. Amen. I wish all of you a wonderful day, and let me know what's going on. Much love. Bye-bye.